Thanks again, Alex, for that song as well, and thanks for all of your work. You've been providing us wonderful music this whole time of the pandemic. So now it's my turn to talk for a minute, and I will tell you that somewhere in the middle of writing this week's talk, I realized that I was creating the second part of a pair of Sunday messages that focused on different moments in the pandemic. Last week, I was looking at the disturbance of our head and heart and our very soul that we've encountered in the midst of the pandemic. And this week, I'll be looking ahead, anticipating our post-pandemic world. In both weeks, I tried to find direct links to the practice of Unitarian Universalism that were present in or will be present in those moments. Last week, I lifted up the fifth tenet of our religiously liberal legacy, that we have the resources to make meaningful change in our lives, and the availability of those resources justifies an attitude of optimism. And this week, I was drawn to reconnect us to the dynamic partners of our tradition, continuous revelation, and the primacy of the prophetic in our lives. This week's talk includes a nifty word that Leonard is going to share on the screen for you all right now. Now, there's at least two possible pronunciations of the word, and we're going to have a little fun. We're going to conduct an interactive, non-binding poll at the beginning of this talk to see how you would pronounce it. You're going to be invited to choose either the first option, chronocentric, or the second option, chronocentric. Leonard will pop up the poll right now, and you get to pick. Now, everybody get to vote now, so give it a shot. The poll results are instantaneous, so click in. Look, oh my gosh. Oh my heavens. This is Biden versus Trump. Oh my heaven. Okay. Who would have thunk it? Okay, thank you, Leonard. I think I call that 5149, right? I mean, that's quite impressive. That means I can say it any which way, and it doesn't really matter. So I appreciate that very much. I will also say that that there may be an unintended consequence here that I don't like. I maybe should not have set a precedent of having polls during a sermon. I'm not sure if I want to live up to that. Anyway, thank you very much. We can take that one down when we're done. So I'm going to start with chronocentric, just so you know. And I might go to chronocentric. But it was in an article in the Atlantic magazine, I think it was in May, by Yasha Mounk. And he wrote that when confronted with disaster, believing that everything will change is all too easy. The current pandemic is a powerful filter of our vision. There are folks who suggest that it will prove to be the hinge event of modern history. And we regularly read, I think we all do, of all the changes that will happen post-pandemic. The workplace will never be the same. Remote work will be normalized. And when we're not tethered to an in-person work site, we'll see a move away from cities. The healthcare system in the US will change. It has to change. Childcare will finally be recognized as essential work. Folks across the country will grow home gardens, supporting their sense of resilience in the face of potential future disruptions. A new look at incarceration rates and length of terms will be undertaken. All of these and more have been proposed as the post-pandemic postulations. But maybe as a summary of those post-pandemic predictions, we might look at Jeremy Lint, a columnist in the online magazine Open Democracy. He recently wrote that whatever you might be thinking about the long-term impacts of the coronavirus epidemic, you're probably not thinking big enough. The impact of the coronavirus on our global civilization will only just be unfolding. The massive disruptions we're already seeing in our lives are just the first heralds of a historic transformation in political and societal norms. Clearly, I'm sorry, there's a distraction there. Clearly, we're sorting out what will be the post-pandemic impacts on our lives. As we go through that sorting, there has been a kind of general challenge to how we position ourselves in this moment. That challenge is embodied in the term chronocentrism or chronocentrism. In 1974, the sociologist Jib Fowles coined the term chronocentrism, the belief that one's own times are paramount, that other periods pale in comparison. And more recently, Thomas Sandage, in his book, The Victorian Internet, refined the definition of chronocentrism as the egotism that one's generation is poised on the very cusp of history. It is to time, he said, what ethnocentrism is to ethnicity. The past several months have understandably confronted us with an especially loud chorus of chronocentric voices claiming that we are on the cusp of unprecedented change. Sandage and others seem to be wagging their finger at the collective narcissism we exhibit when we think we're poised on the very cusp of history. I'll warn you, I'm probably about to reveal some embarrassing lack of vision on my part, but when I read chronocentric, my first thought was, well, yeah, that's where we as Unitarian Universalists live, poised on the very cusp of history. This is a perilous spot to inhabit. I recognize that our liberal religious legacy carries the dynamism of continuous revelation, that general sense that God or science or our capacity to embrace the new is not limited to what has gone on before. That's why the simple interpretation of continuous revelation has always been no dogma. And I don't mean in this moment to take us out of history by putting us on the cusp of history. That would be folly to take ourselves out of history. We must be informed by history and whenever necessary, reconcile its oppressive inherited structures through our future actions. But continuous revelation has the tendency to land us right on the cusp of history. The second dynamic aspect of our faith tradition is our predisposition to think prophetically. You've heard me offer this several times. It's a simple three-step way we move through life. First, we look at the world as it is, and I want to make sure that that view of our current state includes historical factors. The next step is to envision the world as we think it should be. And finally, we must act to make it so. Both continuous revelation and the prophetic process propel us to a position on the cusp of history. And remember, from last week, our legacy also tends to believe that we can find the resources necessary to make meaningful change in our lives. So yeah, Unitarian Universalism, religious liberalism, has a legacy of optimism in our capacity to make meaningful change, to make history. It is this reality that we live in as Unitarian Universalists is a recipe for a whole bunch of work and the likelihood of abundant failures. How's that for a UU elevator speech? Well, Unitarian Universalism is a recipe for a lot of work and abundant failures. Does Sounds pretty convincing, huh, to a new person? But we have to be clear that working with others to make change is filled with pitfalls. Our experience of the pandemic has highlighted that. That's why the cusp of history is a perilous place to inhabit. That's why we might be individually motivated to engage, but we must enter that workspace of making meaningful change with an overriding sense of mutuality. Yeah, we're chronocentric, but really isn't living fully, living in the here and now, attuned to our prophetic visions, a moment where we all live? You know, I always thank Miriam for the moment for all ages. And I was honest with her a week or so ago when she introduced me to the reading that she was going to offer today. And I said she should definitely read it. But I also said I had no idea what the heck it was all about. I mean, there was a little wave and there was a big wave and then there was all the water. But you should know that Miriam hung tough and tried at least a couple times to help me understand it. And I do thank you, Miriam. And I realized, maybe this works, I realized that as I wrote, that maybe I had written into an example of the wave as part of the whole water. Maybe we rise up as individual swells. Waves have cusps, right? Maybe we rise up as individual swells within a sea of other waves that make us all a part of the water, and our mutuality is described by the sea, and our individual action is found in the rising of the waves. Miriam, if nothing else, I tried, okay? I kept trying. But for me, there's something too pacific about an allusion to the sea. As I wrote this talk, I realized I wasn't just writing a review about post-pandemic possibilities or a counterpoint to the negative assessments of chronocentrism. This was becoming an exhortation, not a simple talk. There was one more detailed post-pandemic projection that landed me in full exhortation mode. It comes from Fareed Zakaria, that news commentator and author, and he suggested in his book, 10 Lessons for the Post-Pandemic World, that the most likely outcome of the pandemic will not reshape history so much as accelerate it. And this is the great part. To illuminate his sense of the acceleration of history, Zakaria invoked a quote from Vladimir Lenin, who is supposed to have said, "There are decades when nothing happens, and there are weeks when decades happen." Okay. I think we need to rise up like the rising swells at Mavericks, you know, that big wave mecca on California's coast where 50 to 80 foot monsters periodically show up. Just like those weeks that Lenin talked about where decades happen periodically showing up in a week. Let's accelerate the hell out of history in our post-pandemic times. Let's not shrink back from seeing ourselves on the cusp of history out of deference to the fact that history has been made before. Let's move forward with the knowledge that it might not work, and if failures come our way, it's not an indication of our imperfection, because we're not perfect to begin with, and we're not going to be perfect. But if we can make meaningful change in our lives, if we rise up again and again, and we continue to inhabit the very cusp of history. One of the rules they tell you about delivering a sermon is never mention anyone in the audience. Don't pluck them out. And I've already broke that rule when I raised up the good work of Miriam, but I hope I got by with that one. But I'm going to break that rule again and lift up what I heard Wayne say after a service a couple weeks ago. It is a time for action, he said. He was supportive of preparing for action, but at some point we have to act. And for me, that was an exhortation as well. it was a call to action. It was a call to take the third step in our prophetic process, to act. Through our action, our post-pandemic possibilities can be history making. I'm going to close with the words from Roger Schutz. He's the former prior of the Taizé, internationally renowned ecumenical monastery in France. A friend of mine actually sent this to me yesterday, and mentioned to me that Taizé was formed during World War II, and its early members from Switzerland and France worked against the onslaught of Nazism in support of Jews fleeing the danger. Schutz writes, during the darkest periods of history, quite often a small number of men and women scattered throughout the world have been able to reverse the course of historical evolutions. This was only possible because they hoped beyond all hope. What had been bound for disintegration then entered into the current of a new dynamism. Sounds like Unitarian Universalists and the cusp of history we inhabit. Thank you.